Number 1. The scariest moment of my life occurred sometime in July 2008, around 2 a.m. at our summer house in Nigeria. I was 12 years old, hiding in a closet with my mum, my brother, and our dog. On the other side of the wall, a group of men armed with guns and other weapons were in the process of breaking into our home. Their sole purpose was to murder us. There's really no way to condense the events of that night, but here it goes. The home invasion began just after 12 a.m. and lasted over 2 hours in total. I still remember the way I was jolted awake by my mum, and the way her eyes looked, wide and full of utter fear. It was something I'd never seen before. She covered my mouth and woke my brother, gesturing for us to be quiet and to follow her into her room. That's when I started to hear it. The loud banging of metal hammers, and the drills the men were using as they attempted to break open our metal front doors. The thing is, these people weren't there to rob us. The sound they were making, the noise of the drills, it could all be heard by the entire street. They didn't care who heard them. They weren't there for money. We knew that whoever these people were, they were there to kill us. My mother's mobile phone had been disabled. It was possible to disable the network access remotely, rendering it unable to make any outgoing calls. We were completely trapped. A bit of background. Almost exactly a year earlier, we had been victims in that very same house to a botched robbery attempt. Men had broken into our home, gathered our family, including my grandparents who were visiting at the time, and took us all into the bathroom. They then ransacked the house. The robbers had no idea my grandparents had a personal armed security officer who always travelled with them, and one of the robbers was shot dead while the others escaped. After that event, the house had undergone some serious security upgrade. Every single door in the house, both external and internal, had been replaced with bulletproof bolted metal doors. Every room in the property was essentially turned into a safe room. This is what saved us years later when the men, who we believe may have been the same robbers from the year before, came for their revenge. When my mother realized she couldn't use her phone, she ran to her bedroom window and screamed, "Please, for the love of God, help us." Writing this is literally making my eyes water because it was such a traumatic event. She screamed as loud as she could so that the neighbors would hear us. One of the invaders shot at her from outside, and thank God he missed. The bullet hit the wall just underneath the window. That's when we knew that these men were there to kill us. There was no one in that street who didn't hear what was happening. Like I said, we were spending summer in Nigeria, where there's no official 911 equivalent number, or even a reliable police service. I'm British Nigerian, so we spent some periods of time there during my childhood. I know if I really go into depth about everything that happened that night, it would take too long and be far too traumatic to relive. What I will say is this: 4 very specific factors saved our lives that night. The fact that we had changed our doors after the botched robbery, the stupidity of the men trying to get to us, a silent dog, and, most importantly, an accidental phone call. Let me explain. My mum's screaming made them work faster, and the noise of their drills got louder, but after an hour and a half, they were still unable to break through the metal front doors. The amount of time specified here is very important. They were drilling and hammering at our front door for an hour and a half, and in all that time, they didn't notice the huge balcony that sits above our front door. The door that led to the balcony was made of glass. It was only after an hour and a half that they finally noticed it. By this point, we were hiding in my mother's tiny closet room. One of the men found a ladder, got up to the balcony, broke the glass door and entered the house, where he was then able to open the front doors and let the remaining men in. The man just happened to know where we hid the front door key downstairs. This is where the true terror began. They were now inside our home. These men, armed with guns, with their only intention being to slay my family. I still remember how cold the floor felt. I remember getting a cramp in my leg. We were all crouched in the closet together, and I recall the way my body was shaking so violently as I took what I believed to be my last look at my family. I looked at my brother, and his face was just completely blank, like he was staring into nothing. My mother had her eyes closed, and I think she was praying. We weren't holding hands. We hardly even looked at each other. Nobody said a word. There was no family moment, no tearful goodbyes, even though I'm sure we all believed we wouldn't survive. This is where the silent dog comes into play. You see, my brother and I had this pet dog called Jack. He was in there with us, small German Shepherd cross who would never shut up. This dog loved to bark, and he would bark at the smallest of sounds. Not one of us will ever be able to explain why this dog didn't make a sound that entire night. Maybe it was the overwhelming smell of fear. Maybe it was something else. But that dog did not so much as whimper. And if he had, those men would have known exactly which room we were in. The thing is, when the men finally got into the house, they weren't expecting the inside doors to be metal too, bulletproof and bolted to boot. There were 4 bedrooms to choose from, and they didn't know which room we were in. If Jack had barked, if he'd made any kind of noise at all, they would have known. They started drilling on the wrong door. They were directly on the other side of the wall, and we could hear every footstep. We could even hear them talking as clear as day. It would have been easier for them to break through the wall if they knew we were there, and the only thing that prevented that was our silent dog. But still, the final factor, the one mistake that truly saved our lives that night, was a mistake made by my mother's driver, Justin, who we believe was involved in the murder attempt. Before the men had broken into the house, they had attempted to call my mother's mobile phone. They basically had planned to call and say something like, "We have your driver Justin here, and if you don't open these doors right now, we'll kill him." But Justin the driver, whose phone was used to make the call, had my mother's phone number and my grandmother's phone number saved under very similar names in his phone. They accidentally called my grandmother while attempting to call my mum, and delivered the threats to her. Unlike the previous year, my grandparents weren't visiting at the time. They were in a completely different city. When my gran received the call, she had no idea it was happening to us in Lagos. She called the police to her house, only to realize there were no intruders there. That's when she put 2 and 2 together and called the commissioner of the police in Lagos directly, who in turn sent policemen to our house. 2 hours had already passed, and when the men heard the police sirens, they realized their time was up. There was no way they were getting through those metal doors. They fled and escaped, and 30 minutes later, we heard men knocking on our bedroom door. "Ma'am, are you in there? This is the police. Please open the door." It took us 20 minutes to muster up the courage to open the door. We didn't know if it was really the police, or just the intruders pretending to be them. I've never felt relief like I felt when I saw their uniforms. It was hours before I could stop shaking. It's also worth noting that before the police that my grandmother sent arrived, our neighbours had called the local police when the men were still outside trying to break into our front door. Some useless local officers had come by, but made no attempt to help us. Instead, they had essentially just stood outside the gate, firing gunshots into the air, attempting to scare the bad guys away, and then they just left a few minutes later. The attackers went right back to work, drilling the front door as soon as they left. Afterwards, the police stayed with us while we packed what we could. They then escorted us away. I remember looking up to my mum's bedroom window before getting into the car and seeing the gunshot hole in the wall. The shot that almost killed her. We left the country soon after and returned home to the UK. I haven't been back to Nigeria since. Number 2. This isn't my story, but my Uncle Pete's. He's a very successful man, and lives in a massive house in California. I won't specify where exactly, but it's a very upmarket area. Now, when you're so obviously rich, you have to take some security measures to make sure nobody comes and steals all your shit. You might call him paranoid, and he'd probably admit to being a bit mistrustful of people himself. But when you're living with a target on your back, it would be stupid not to take any precautions. He's got security cameras both outside and even inside his house, a state-of-the-art alarm system that monitors the entrance to the property, and a big, thick gate surrounds the estate. He also has a couple of German shepherds now, which he didn't have back when this incident took place. But the rest of it was all there back then, and it didn't help a bit. It was 2015, and one evening after work, my Uncle Pete decided to unwind at the golf range. He hopped in his car and went down to the range, parked up, and spent a while practicing his swing. Afterwards, he drove back to his property, typed in the code to open the front gate, and parked up in the garage. The CCTV cameras were still working normally, and the alarm was still set when he arrived back home. Nothing suspicious or out of place, just another evening in paradise. He grabbed a beer out of the fridge and took a seat in front of his massive TV. He lived alone back then, so he cranked up the volume real loud and put on some 2.5 Men. I never said he was a man of taste. He was maybe halfway through the episode when the show did one of those fade to black moments to end the scene. You know how when a TV screen goes black and you can more easily see reflections in it? Well, against the black, dark background, he noticed something he couldn't see before. In the reflection of the giant TV screen was a figure. When he told me this story, my uncle said how his stomach instantly dropped. Rather than an instantaneous fight-or-flight response, he said he just sort of felt lightheaded and absent, like he wasn't really there, like he was suddenly hollowed out. As if on autopilot, he turned around to see a man behind him. The guy was decked out in overalls, and was wearing one of those face masks that people in East Asia wear when they've got a cold, like a surgical mask. He had a pair of sunglasses on to cover his eyes. In the guy's hands was a fucking taser. Whoever he was in the process of creeping up to my uncle, still in that awkward pose you form when trying not to make a sound. It wasn't the noise that alerted my uncle, only sheer dumb luck that the fade to black happened at that precise moment. Uncle Pete shook himself from his empty trance and made a beeline for the safe room upstairs. My uncle was only a small guy, and a quick glance at this intruder was enough to determine that he wouldn't be able to take him in a one-on-one struggle. There was enough distance between them for him to successfully make a break for it, though. He lunged up the stairs, praying not to trip over. All the way, he could hear the guy in the mask behind him, his footsteps and hollers. My uncle made it to the bedroom and locked the door behind him, giving him enough time to get into the safe room inside. Once he was in, that was game, set and match. This thing was more secure than a bank vault and was hidden behind a large mirror in the bedroom. I've seen it, and this room is like something out of a damn James Bond movie. Not only was the entrance effectively invisible, but it was almost completely impenetrable. The intruder must have known the jig was up when he finally slammed his way into the bedroom, only to find that my uncle wasn't there. The monitor in the panic room was linked to the CCTV cameras around the house, and my uncle could see the guy panicking on the other side of the wall. Though my uncle had a gun inside the safe room, he decided the best course of action was to stay put and not confront the guy. Besides, there was a far more valuable device inside the safe room. A phone. It wasn't long before the cops arrived, by which point the intruder had fled the scene. They searched the entire perimeter of the house and found no signs of a forced entry. The outside alarm system hadn't been tampered with at all. Looking through the outside CCTV footage of that entire day, there was no footage of the man entering or even just approaching the house. It was as if he had just materialized out of thin air, like he never existed before appearing in the property. Then they checked the cameras that monitored the inside. The first images of the man were when he entered through the door to the garage. According to the police, the only way this guy could have got into the house was by hiding in the trunk of Uncle Pete's car and somehow keeping the door slightly ajar. This most likely happened while my uncle was at the range. When my uncle hopped back into his car and drove home, he was completely oblivious to the guy in the back. The guy was still in the back when my uncle parked up in his garage. As such, he was able to bypass all of the outside security. Since there were no cameras in the actual garage, the intruder was able to take his time before getting out and preparing to approach my uncle. The cops checked the trunk of my uncle's car. Inside, they found towels, cable ties, and a goddamn hammer. None of these things belonged to my uncle, and no DNA evidence could be collected from any of them. This guy's intentions were pretty clear, and thanks to the panic room, my uncle was able to dodge a bullet, or in this case, a bludgeoning. He bought his guard dogs 2 days later. Number 3. I'll try and keep this short. I was about 15 years old when this happened, and my little sister was maybe 14 or so. I was born and raised in Holland, but my mum is originally from Thailand. Though she loves where we live and has many friends here, she's never really gotten over her homesickness. On a relatively frequent basis, she likes to return to her home country to visit family and friends. She used to make more of a habit of doing this when we were younger, and my father, who's a very rich man, ended up buying a small yet luxurious property for her in Thailand. That way she'd never have to worry about accommodation, and could live in comfort when she made a return visit. He even hired a maid for her, a sweet young woman called Kamlai, who ended up working for us for a number of years. She wasn't exactly beautiful, but definitely had a wholesome quality, and I'd had a little crush on her from a young age. She had been notified when we were coming to stay at the property, and would help my mother out with the cooking and cleaning. So around 6 years ago, my sister and I were with our mother on one of these trips, but due to work commitments, my father had to stay back in Holland. We always loved going to Thailand. It's kind of a love it or hate it type of country. There's definitely some sleazy aspects to it, sure, but I've always found it to have a certain charm. It's totally unique, and unlike any other place I've been. We generally spent our days relaxing by the pool, exploring the local area, and getting into all sorts of mischief. One particular night, my mother had made plans to see some of her childhood friends who she hadn't seen in the longest time. My sister and I were going to be chilling at the house with Kamlai, who was going to make us some dinner as well. Our mother had been gone for maybe an hour or so, and the three of us were in the middle of a game of Monopoly, laughing and joking away without a care in the world. One thing I do remember though, is that Kamlai kept checking her phone and was sending frequent text messages to somebody. It hardly even registered at the time, but in hindsight, this was very significant. Kamlai suddenly got up from the table and said that she'd be back in a minute. Without any explanation, she just upped and walked out the back door, leaving it wide open. That was a bit weird and out of character, but whatever. My sister and I had been drilled by our parents from a young age to always keep the doors locked, especially at night. and my sister, being Miss Goody Two-Shoes, got up and locked the door almost immediately. "What's the point of doing that? Camli'll be back in a minute," I remember saying. "Well, she can just knock and I'll let her back in then," my sister replied. Maybe 60 seconds pass, and we hear Camli trying to open the door. My sister got up and walked towards it to let her in. Only it wasn't Camli. Through the glass panel in the door, she saw a wiry, tall man furiously pulling at the handle. He spoke in Thai and said something we understood to mean, "What the fuck?" Then another man's voice saying he was going to try the front door. My sister screamed. An instant surge of adrenaline coursed through me. Jesus Christ, I remember thinking. I have to protect my little sister. Even without getting a good look at these guys though, I knew I'd stand no chance against them. I was just a young lad after all. We couldn't fight back. What we could do was hide. You see, this house had a secret not even Camli knew. The hidden wine cellar. In case of emergencies, my parents had told us about it and made us promise not to tell a soul. There was a decorative wall in the kitchen. To the untrained eye, it just looked like any other ordinary wall. In reality, it gave way to my parents' wine cellar. There was nothing fortified about this cellar. There was no Kevlar padding, no bolted doors or cameras or any kind of weapons down there. But it was well hidden, and it was all we had. I grabbed my sister, and the pair of us rushed down to our makeshift panic room, being careful to close the entrance door behind us properly. If we could remain silent, these men wouldn't be able to find us. That was our hope, at least. My sister and I sat down there in total blackness, breathing as silently as possible. A crashing upstairs let us know that these guys were now in the house with us. My sister had her cell phone with her, but neither of us knew the Thai emergency number. She called our mum and whispered hysterically into the phone. Our mum contacted the police directly, and then stayed on the line with my sister as she rushed back to the house. All the while, we could hear the ruckus above us as the men frantically searched the house. From what we could hear though, they weren't looking for a safe or any kind of expensive items. No, they were looking for us, saying things like, "Kids, come out. We're friends with your parents. Didn't they tell you we were coming over?" One thing I'll never forget is the way one of them kept whistling. An unsettling. The kind of whistle you make when you call your dog to you. From the light of my sister's phone, I could see the fear plastered on her face. It was palpable. We waited for help to arrive with bated breath. I doubt we were down in the cellar for too long, but it felt like an eternity. At some point, things went eerily silent. The men above us had stopped making noise. We weren't sure whether they were gone, or if this was some sort of trap to lure us out. So we remained where we were. Then, after what felt like forever, the most beautiful sound I have ever heard in my life. Police sirens. Our makeshift panic room had served us well. The house was searched from top to bottom, and the intruders were nowhere to be seen. They'd made off with a laptop and some of my mother's jewelry, but other than that, it appeared as though they had just trashed the house looking for us. Camli was nowhere to be seen either, and for good reason. As we'd later find out, she was in on the whole thing from the very beginning, and had actually tipped these men off as to when my sister and I would be home alone. Obviously, she was well aware of my father's wealth, and she and her accomplices wanted a slice of the pie. Their plan was to break into my father's holiday home, abduct his children, namely us, and hold us ransom. Camli had left the back door open intentionally when she got up to leave the house. If my sister hadn't instinctively locked it immediately, there would have been nothing stopping these men from just walking in, and we wouldn't have had a chance to hide. The men were actually caught a week later robbing another house in the area, and one of them drew his gun and shot at the police. He was quickly blown to pieces. His accomplice surrendered afterwards. Turns out they were cousins, and the one who gave himself up was Camlai's brother. They tracked her down later that night. The pair of them are currently in separate Thai prisons. From what I've heard, that's the last place on Earth you'd ever want to end up. In a way, I do feel sorry for Camlai. She was always so sweet and nice with us. Even just before the incident, she was making us laugh and smile. I can't help but feel like she was somehow coerced into this plan by her cousin and brother, or maybe even forced into it. Whatever the case, she ended up throwing her life away, and thankfully, my sister and I still have ours. I'm all too aware that in real life, these ransom deals don't always end happily, especially in Thailand. In a lot of cases, the criminals receive their money, and the hostages are never seen or heard from again. My sister and I are very happy we didn't add to that statistic. Hi guys, Lazy here, and thank you very much for listening. Wow, it's been quite a while, huh? Well, I'm finally back from Hong Kong and Taiwan, so hopefully I'll be getting a few more videos out very soon as well. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed this subject. I don't think anyone's ever covered panic room stories before, so hopefully it was something a little different. I'm saying hopefully a lot, aren't I? But yeah, if you did like this, then please be sure to smash that like button, or I'll smash you. And why not consider subscribing and following me on the social media channels, yada yada yada. Anyway guys, you all stay spooky. And remember, the best things happen in the dark.